let me begin. Any housekeeping issues to take care about? Any questions about anything? I tried to uh, keep the website up to date, so I loaded some more materials to the first module from last week, and again, as I said before, I uploaded the recording of last week's session, and I'll have this the recording of this session up by tomorrow on the website in case you missed something or you want to go over it or you just want to watch it again. Okay, very good. Excellent. So today we're going to talk about vaccine trials for COVID-19. I'm assuming that you guys have reviewed some of the vaccine trials that are going on in the UAE. I'll just assume that, and there bound to be some more coming down the pike. So the learning objectives for this session is to discuss the ethical and scientific norms, trade-offs in accelerating vaccine development in the setting of a pandemic, how to balance the social and scientific values when one is trying to accelerate the development of a vaccine, and discuss the ethics of vaccine challenge studies in healthy human volunteers. And we'll also talk about the issue of emergency use authorization of vaccines. So let me put up this slide. So if you could scan this code or go to this, the website. I have a few polling questions to ask you guys to keep you on your toes during this presentation. So everybody could scan that code. Okay, good. So as by way of introduction, vaccines have some distinct features from drugs. The target population is healthy people, and hence the tolerability of adverse events is going to be less. And the screening for inclusion-exclusion criteria is very critical to minimize the risks, or at least make sure, to minimize the risks. And the criteria for any successful vaccine development are safety, efficacy, and the duration of immunity. I was just reading this morning. I forgot what context it was in, but they determined the amount of antibodies that are generated when someone experience COVID illness is very low. It's only 4% of the population. And if that's the case, it's going to be very hard to realize any concept of herd immunity in the population. So there's been some talk about, well, let's just get enough people infected with the COVID virus, and then all those people will have immunity, thus creating herd immunity for the whole country. Well, don't hold your breath for that one. So this slide just shows you the various type of vaccine candidates that is coming down the pipeline. We have RNA types, DNA, live, attenuated, inactivated, protein-based, and it's just a lot of different mechanisms to develop a vaccine. So typically, to develop a vaccine, it takes years of research and testing. And we're talking about normally five to 10 years. All the other previous vaccines that we have taken this long. However, researchers worldwide, because of the urgency of developing a vaccine for this pandemic, researchers are working around the clock to find a vaccine against the COVID virus. And this Herculean effort means that a fast-track vaccine could come to the market anywhere. I mean, they're saying anywhere by the end of 2020 to the middle of 2021. And to date, there are just 2 coronavirus vaccines that has been approved. One is called Sputnik V, approved by the Russian Ministry of Health in August. And then another vaccine from Russia has also been granted regulatory approval. And there are concerns with these vaccines because the safety and efficacy have not been tested in phase 3 trials. And China has been, the China National Biotech Group has been developing a vaccine, and just recently, companies have given this vaccine to medical workers and employees being sent abroad under an emergency authorization for people in high-risk categories. And also just recently, China has also given this vaccine to students who are studying abroad. So there are, I guess, many different ways to accelerate the approval of a vaccine, which we'll talk more about. So the issue is how best to accelerate vaccine development without compromising ethical, social, and scientific norms. For sure, in the setting of a pandemic, and especially this pandemic, there's a sense of urgency exists to develop vaccines against emerging infection. The urgency comes from the numerous global cases and deaths and the widespread social and economic disruption. So how do you balance the utilitarian concern of enhancing social or decreasing social economic disruption against the usual norms of ethics and scientific testing, meaning that how do you balance the utilitarian norms against the norms of safety and efficacy? So, and the reason why that's an important question to answer is that this pressure to develop vaccines due to a sense of public health urgency has occasionally backfired. Recently, one in the 1930s, a hastily tested vaccine resulted in several deaths and numerous cases of vaccine-associated paralytic polio. In the 1950s, after the successful randomized trial of Salk's inactivated polio vaccine in children and the vaccine's quick licensure, a contaminated vaccine lot led to unexpected events and deaths. In 1976, the US government quickly produced and widely distributed a swine flu vaccine in response to fear of an influenza pandemic. However, that influenza pandemic never really materialized, and children who were vaccinated experienced a high rate of adverse reactions to the vaccine, and more than 500 vaccinated persons developed vaccine-induced Guillain-Barré syndrome. So safety is an important consideration in developing these vaccines. Having said that, there are different ways to accelerate vaccine development. Now, traditionally, let's see, where's the, oh, yes. So, one, we could just stick with the traditional individual randomized controlled trial. There is the possibility to have cluster randomized designs where you randomize villages or towns. You could combine phase 1 and phase 2 in order to speed up the process. You could do controlled human infection or human challenge studies, which we'll discuss later on. We could have innovative adaptive designs that we talked briefly about last week that allow parallel testing of multiple candidates, or you could resort to the emergency use authorization, which we'll talk about later on in this presentation. So many phase 3 vaccine studies failed because the dose chosen did not balance best safety and efficacy. Either a lot of safety issues or the vaccine is not as efficacious as one hoped that it would be. Also, another concern with the developing vaccines is that the immune function could decline with age, and hence we're talking about booster shots and also extra shots for the elderly, because if the immune function declines, that may lead to poor vaccine responses. So again, we talked about how to accelerate vaccine development, and one way is to combine the phases, phase 1 and phase 2, and sometimes we do that ordinarily in other types of clinical trials. And some of the vaccines being developed are combining phases 1 and 2 to try to get rapidly to phase 3. This slide shows the current coronavirus vaccine tracker, and we see the number of vaccines in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and there are 6 vaccines that has been approved for early or limited use. No vaccines has been approved for full use, and in fact, in this category of 6, you guys have 2 of them. If I'm correct, there's this one vaccine that you guys have in the UAE. This vaccine from China, and apparently on September 14th, UAE gave emergency approval for this vaccine to use on healthcare workers. Is that right? Do I have that right? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Abu Dhabi?
In Abu Dhabi,
yeah, but not Dubai. Yeah. In Abu Dhabi and Ministry of Health, but not Dubai Health Authority.
I see. Okay, and then you have apparently another one from China that's also has been given emergency approval for healthcare workers. Before Sinopharm shared data indicating it was safe and effective. And these companies are making plans for producing 1 billion doses a year. So there is this concept of emergency use authorization. So there are several controversies with the current randomized controlled trials for vaccines that are in the development phase. So let me ask you a question. One concern is what is the outcome variable of a vaccine? Go to your smartphone, and what should be the aim of a vaccine trial? Protect people only from the most mild form of COVID-19, or prevent its most serious complications? If you're going to have a vaccine, what do you want it for? Mild form in addition to the serious form, or focus on the serious complications? This is not a, well, I was going to say this is not a trick question, but actually, in a way, it might be. So, yeah, I think it's intuitive that if we're developing a vaccine, we want to have a vaccine that prevents its most serious complications: hospitalization, ICU admission, and obviously deaths. Okay. However, in this article written recently, these coronavirus trials don't answer the one question we need to know. So essentially, if you look at how these vaccine trials are being powered and the sample size, okay, the sample size is such that the final determination of efficacy will occur after 150 to 160 participants have developed COVID-19. Or the trial could be stopped earlier in interim analysis if the active group is more protected than the placebo group. However, it all depends on how you define in the protocol developing a COVID illness. And essentially, in these vaccine studies, they're saying anyone in either group who develops a cough plus a positive lab test is considered someone who has developed COVID-19. Okay, now, this is obviously mild COVID illness, which is far more common than severe COVID-19. And there's no guarantee that reducing the risk of mild COVID-19 will also reduce the risk of moderate or severe COVID-19. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that if you have 150 participants and 80% of them has developed mild COVID-19, and the study shows that those people who are vaccinated did not get mild COVID-19, and people in the placebo group developed just mild COVID-19, then you're going to approve that vaccine only on the basis that it has prevented mild COVID-19. And I don't think that's what we want. We want to make sure that the vaccine is able to prevent the most serious effects of the coronavirus. And hence, the study should be powered on the provision that we're going to have enough individuals in the placebo group who are getting serious illness from COVID-19. And that's one of the issues about it. All depends on how you define efficacy with these vaccines. Now, the other thing, now somebody asked, I can't remember from last week, somebody asked, are there any issues in having concurrent COVID clinical trials? And I thought about that, and I actually came upon this article here, Fair and Equitable Subject Selection in Concurrent COVID Clinical Trials. So I have down here a breakout room, but why don't we just have a discussion? What do you think are the issues with having concurrent clinical trials in regards to fair and equitable subject selection and informed consent?
I think one of the potential issues is that having concurrent vaccine clinical trials could change the background prevalence of COVID, but then that's more related to the efficacy. So we're focusing on subject selection.
Right. Yes. Right.
I guess there could be, well, there's most likely going to be overlap in the target population for the study.
What do you mean overlap?
Well, they're going to have similar inclusion, exclusion criteria, I
Right.
imagine.
Yes. Right.
Is that an issue?
And who do you, I guess, who do you decide to target for which study? Do you target everyone for the same for the competing studies, or?
I mean, I think the best way to do it would be to have a 3-arm trial. You know, where you've got the placebo, you've got vaccine 1, vaccine 2, so you could look at a sort of superiority. But they're not going to do that because they're essentially competing companies.
Right, yeah, they're different companies.
This is happening with the Chinese vaccine in Abu Dhabi at the moment. So they have same company. They're having Wuhan vaccine, they have Beijing vaccine, and the placebo as a clinical trial. Though.
Oh, okay.
It's been completed already. I mean, the clinical trial in UAE has been completed, but still many people did not take the second dose yet. Maybe the next week would be last day probably to receive the second dose. And
right.
then
okay. So how do you ensure that you get the same representation in both trials? And do you need to randomize it between the two studies?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, so that you want to get a representative sample of, according to your eligibility. But I mean, yeah, we also have we have the Russian trial going on, but that's much smaller. But you're essentially looking at the efficacy in a certain sample of the population, which might not represent the whole UAE population where you want to implement mass vaccination.
Right, yeah, you may not get the same representation. Now, what in terms of, well, so in the ideal world, you would want to have some kind of coordination. I remember I used to do a lot of sepsis trials in the ICU, and there would be a lot of competing sepsis trials, different drugs, different drug companies, and we got to the point where within the same hospital, we would have some kind of randomization scheme, whereas I would enroll patients in my trial on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then on Tuesday and Thursday, the competing trial would randomize their patients. Now, it would probably be difficult to do that in different hospitals, to have that kind of coordination. What about issues about informed consent? Do you tell patients that there are, when you get to the alternative section of informed consent, do you tell patients there are another type of vaccine trial going on? Does it make a difference to patients whether they get the vaccine study from Russia or China or from another country?
The two studies were not initiated at the same time. I mean, the Chinese came first and almost finalized the randomization and then started the Russian study. So they did not happen concurrently at the same time.
Oh, you didn't have it concurrently. I
No.
see. Okay. All right. Well, that makes sense.
The Russian vaccine has not started yet. I think by next week they might start. They haven't got the final IRB from Abu Dhabi yet. They only got conditional approval for IRB, but not finalized. They're also working on the protocol. They are just in the protocol because they do some changes from the protocol been applied in Russia, and they weren't going to be applied over here because some changes was required by the, I think, IRB committee in Abu Dhabi to look into it and try to submit a new protocol. Same thing happened with the Chinese vaccine, where the protocol were implemented in China is not exactly the same one was implemented in Abu Dhabi and in Mohab here, Ministry of Health, for example. There is lots of alteration has been done, lots of changes has been done, and even probably the exclusion and inclusion criteria has been modified between the two. But overall, they're using same vaccine, which is Wuhan vaccine and Beijing vaccine and the placebo. But the subject, the people who take the vaccine, they don't know what they're taking, either vaccine or is it a placebo. They're not aware of anything.
The Chinese vaccine happened concurrently, but they were in one trial. And the person who takes the vaccine knows that he can get either a vaccine or placebo, and there are two types of vaccine.
But I think what's interesting is that theoretically, the having implemented the Chinese vaccine, that could have contamination effects with the Russian vaccine because it changes the characteristics of the population. You know, technically, you could have less susceptible now because some have been immunized. I mean, they're not running concurrently, but I think there could be theoretically there could be some knock-on effects of having the Russian vaccine trial after the Chinese, because the Chinese was a much larger sample size. At the moment, I've only the Russian one's quite small, isn't it? It's quite localized.
Chinese, they collected, they had subject of total 32,000 in UAE. We're supposed to have only 15. Supposed to have only 5,000 with Beijing vaccine, 5,000 with Wuhan vaccine, and 5,000 placebo. And the other 30,000 should be between other countries like Egypt, Bahrain, and Jordan. What happened at the moment, they took 32,000 in UAE, and the rest are between Bahrain, Egypt, and Jordan. And there is issue with the power of calculation probably. As Eddie earlier said, Prof, that how many of these people who've been vaccinated, placebo or other vaccinated, they're gonna have the severe disease or they're gonna have only the mild disease? And from the data that I have, I've been discussing with a few colleagues, there is positive cases among the people who've been subjected to the trial, but the majority are mild. Nothing is like serious from what I heard. I don't know these people are really been placebo subject or they've been vaccinated subject, but there is cases among them, yeah, positive cases of COVID-19.
Okay. The other issue is that clinical trials operate on a first come, first served basis. And under this model, patients who are in the know about these studies or have connections may have an unfair advantage over other people, assuming that people are wanting to be in a vaccine study. So do some people have more unfair advantage over other people? Now, this doesn't pertain to competing trials. However, just having a vaccine trial, how do you ensure fair subject selection to give everyone everyone who wants to be in the study the same fair advantage of having the opportunity to be in a vaccine study? And then, as I mentioned before, are patients informed about concurrent multiple trials? So essentially, are there transparency about these existing multiple trials if they are being run concurrently? Essentially, who do we approach for enrollment? And there may be a concern with implicit bias based on who we approach to be part of the study. Do we implicitly ask, do we have some bias in whom we select for subjects in these studies? So it gets just some things to think about as we approach patients to be in these studies, especially since a lot of now, on one hand, a lot of individuals are maybe desperate to be in these vaccine studies. On the other hand, surveys are showing that there's a lot of people who wouldn't even sign up to get the vaccine even after it's been approved. So there are two types of populations. So those are some of the issues just with the regular randomized controlled trials regarding vaccine development. Now, just this past week, the British government announced that they are gearing up. They have given approval to this pharmaceutical company to gear up for a human challenge trial, the first COVID-19 human challenge study. They're gearing up to begin that in January, and about 19 to 25 healthy volunteers will begin to be exposed to the virus to test a vaccine. So someone may ask, well, with all these vaccines in the pipeline being developed in randomized controlled trial, someone may ask, well, why are we bothering with a challenge study in which we deliberately, purposefully inject healthy volunteers, not only with the vaccine, but afterwards with the virus itself to test out the efficacy of the vaccine? Why not just let them go around, their business and get exposed the natural way? Why do we have to do these challenge trials? So let's talk about the ethics of challenge studies in healthy volunteers? Challenge studies have a long history. Back in 1796, Edward Jenner discovered the smallpox by intentionally giving infection to an 8-year-old boy to protect against disease. And essentially, he showed that this vaccine that he got from cowpox derived from a lesion on the hand of a dairymaid, that this vaccine was protective. In the 1930s, there were investigation with the inhalation of a human influenza virus. Only 20% developed disease that was mild in intensity, and this model was deemed safe and was utilized for several decades to understand the immune responses to influenza and also be able to test preventative and therapeutic measures. Let's see. So also in the 1960s and 70s, they tested Tamiflu in experimental human influenza studies that were challenge studies, and also a recombinant influenza virus vaccine was also used as a challenge study. So a lot of challenge studies were done testing influenza type vaccines. However, in the early 2000s, there was an influenza human challenge study in which a 21-year-old experienced myocarditis following infection with a mild influenza infection. And despite this volunteer returning to baseline health, and also despite the lack of a direct causality linking the myocarditis to the influenza challenge vaccine, this kind of like stopped challenge studies for several years. Now, having said that, in 2014, there was another challenge study involving an influenza vaccine, and they challenged healthy volunteers, and the results of this study led to the conclusion that challenge studies offer a unique opportunity to evaluate multiple aspects of a virus. And the conclusion from this article was that this study represents the first healthy volunteer influenza challenge model using this type of virus under an investigational new drug application. And hence challenge studies came back to be somewhat favorable to do with influenza virus. Now, something I'll go over in just a few minutes, influenza virus, we have treatment for in case healthy volunteers get ill. And that has been a concern with doing challenge studies with the coronavirus, having what's called a rescue medicine. So let me ask you your viewpoints. Should scientists infect healthy human volunteers with the coronavirus to develop a vaccine? Yes, no, or uncertain? What's your underlying thoughts about that?
How do I vote? I click on.
Do you have it on your smartphone? Did you scan?
No, this is my it's in the laptop.
Oh, okay. Well, you could go to this website.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Oh, okay. Okay, a lot of people voting uncertain. That means you want to hear more about the purpose or the reason why someone would want to purposefully infect healthy volunteers with the virus. And who would want to do that? Okay, so most people are uncertain, which is good. Maybe I'll repeat this poll after the presentation. One person said yes, one person said no. Okay, and
Basically, I am uncertain because unless you infect high risk people, the challenge trial will be of no use. And I don't know how brave we will be to infect high risk people.
Okay, good. Yes, I should ask why people are uncertain. That's a good idea. So you raise a good point. We are not going to take high risk people, right, to be in challenge studies because they're going to be more prone to developing a severe illness from the coronavirus. So we want to take relatively healthy, young individuals. In fact, the inclusion criteria for these studies will be healthy, young individuals between 21 and 30. And we just, as they'll measure the immunologic response to the vaccine and see if they develop mild to moderate symptoms to the coronavirus. And now that brings up something I'll repeat later on. That brings up the issue of generalizability. So now, just like with any randomized controlled trials, we usually have exclusion criteria for sicker people, but once it gets approved for everybody. And the issue is how generalizable are drugs, or in this case, the vaccine, to the riskier population. And that's a drawback with the challenge studies. Other reasons why people are uncertain.
Well, I can say why I'm more certain. I said yes, because I think it would give us lots of valuable information about the candidate vaccines. For example, we could, you're guaranteed that the person who's been vaccinated is going to be exposed, which is not always the case in a population-based vaccine trial. And you could also remove any of the candidate vaccines that don't seem to have any efficacy early on. So you're not wasting time and resources.
Any vaccines that don't have what?
Well, that don't seem to, don't seem to offer any protection in healthy people.
Right. Yes, exactly. In fact, that's one of the reasons to do these challenge studies is because when you're testing out the vaccines, you could determine more effectively which vaccines will be more effective than other candidate vaccines. And then, once you do this small sample challenge studies, now you take the vaccine and you test it in a larger phase study, but you don't need 30,000 individuals to sign up for the vaccine study. So you're absolutely correct that this is a way to develop a more efficacious vaccine where what what we're doing now, we may give approval to, in fact, the plan is if a vaccine shows that it's 50% effective, it's going to gain approval. 50% effective. Now, I'm not sure if that's going to make me feel more comfortable and getting on a plane to travel back to the Middle East, which I had been doing very frequently before the coronavirus. So that's one reason to do these challenge studies. Any other anybody else would like to offer a reason why they said no or uncertain? What's the uncertainty due to, or what's the no due to?
The other reason for being uncertain, because through the vaccine trials which are done now, we already measuring the antibody titer and figuring out who has been infected and who hasn't. So unless the challenge is going to tell us more about what antibody titer is necessary to control the seriousness of the disease, this is another story. But if it's not going to tell us more than just people being infected or not infected, then I don't see it any superior than the usual trial.
Okay, all right, hold that thought. Okay, any other? Hold that thought. That's a good question that I'll answer. Any other thoughts about the uncertainty?
I'm just thinking of a sort of counter perspective is that those that receive the placebo, you're not necessarily exposing them to the virus, but what you're saying is, so with a challenge trial, you vaccinate them, then you purposefully expose them to the virus. In a randomized placebo-controlled trial, those of the placebo are at a higher risk. So I think it's all about balancing this risk and benefit.
Right, there's right, balancing risk and benefits for sure. Now, some people say, I mean, what's the difference between purposefully infecting someone with the virus versus letting them get infected with the virus the natural way?
It's going to take longer when you do
Yes.
it the natural way.
Right. It's going to take longer.
And time is a problem nowadays for us.
Right, that's right. Time is of urgency. Okay. Now, is there is it considered more ethical to let people get infected with the virus the natural way versus being purposefully infected with the virus?
I don't think we are getting the people infected the natural way. We are vaccinating them, and we are observing the infectivity that is already going on in the community. We are not inducing a higher level of infectivity in these.
What about the placebo? They don't know. Placebo.
Even the placebo. What?
They do not receive vaccines, so they're not protected against anything.
But how they are not protected? Because they are told already that what you have taken can be either placebo or a vaccine.
So what subject they can?
All of them.
Yes.
All of them. They don't know what they took exactly. So they are given exactly the same advice.
Yeah, they're supposed to live normally, wear masks, go out, have social distance, not merge with people, and live like everybody else as nothing they haven't taken. So that's what that advice they've been giving.
Yeah, but that's the problem. This will take time for you to get the answer about the effectivity of vaccine is going to take time.
Yeah, to have that 150, 200 subject positive, you need them to be among lots of positive people to catch the virus and then test them again.
So I'm just again, I'm raising the point, is what is the moral importance of who's the agent giving the person the virus? Us purposefully infecting someone, or letting nature, as we sometimes say, letting nature take its course? So what difference does it make how patients get infected? Now, one thing someone could say is that in challenge studies, a person will get infected with the virus, or at least 50% chance of getting infected with the virus, whereas if you go out in the community, your chances of getting infected with the virus, you have some control over that, where you go, mass gatherings. So one could say that one person has more control over whether they're going to get infected or not with the virus. Other than that, I don't see the moral difference, except for balancing risk and benefits. So let's look at the issues. Here's the results of a previous poll from another group of investigators and IRB members. And again, we see predominantly most people are saying no or uncertain. So what would be an ethical framework to use to analyze the ethics of human challenge studies? One, I mean, there are several ethical requirements for research, but I'm listing here the 4 major requirements that I think we need to talk about when we talk about human challenge studies. One is the social value of such a study, the scientific justification, the risks to the participants, and the issue about, is there such a thing as a valid informed consent when we're asking participants to volunteer for these studies, especially, and we'll talk about the incentives that are being offered to the participants to participate in these studies. So in regards to social value, I think that's somewhat clear. I downloaded this map today from the WHO website, and this represents the number of confirmed cases, and this represents the number of deaths worldwide. The last time I gave a similar presentation, I downloaded the WHO map in June, and the number of deaths at that time was about 380,000, and now it's over 1.1 million people. So I think to be sure, developing a vaccine does have social value, and especially if one could develop such a vaccine sooner rather than later. So getting back to the concept of field studies, again, just to review, traditional vaccine studies are conducted in so-called field conditions, essentially similar to future routine use, and essentially participants are randomized to receive either the investigational vaccine or placebo, and the sample size will depend on the incidence or the burden of disease in the study population. So if you have a low incidence of of the virus in the community, you're gonna need larger number of subjects required to estimate the vaccine efficacy. And hence, phase 3 trials are enrolling greater than 30,000 participants, who are, half of them will be exposed to the side effects of the vaccine. So the issue is whether it takes this long to enroll. It takes a long time to enroll 30,000 participants. So the issue is time running out on us to develop a vaccine sooner rather than later? And again, the practical constraints of these vaccine trials are time. Estimates say at least 1 to 1.5 years. Now, there's a lot of thought saying that we might have a vaccine by the end of the year, and I'll show you later on, at least 2 companies are saying they might have results from interim analysis by the end of November or December. Well, you all know about the story about phase 3 trials. There's, again, as I said before, I used to be in sepsis trials, and I've been involved in so many studies in which it showed promising results in phase 2 trials, but then we get to the phase 3 trials, and essentially, I never witnessed a favorable phase 3 study for sepsis trials. So we'll see what happens. And then, as mentioned before, even when a vaccine gets approved, sooner rather than later, the issue is how effective will that vaccine be. Now, a large proportion of the time with these studies are assessing not only efficacy, but the safety in large-scale placebo-controlled phase 3 trials. And one will wind up testing multiple vaccines to get these vaccines that are more efficacious. Now, the other question is, as I mentioned before, these randomized control vaccines being done in the traditional way depends on the incidence or the burden of disease. So where would you want to, which population do you want to choose to test out these vaccines? Well, essentially, you want to have a place where the virus is widespread. So one thought would be Sweden, where they have a low-scale lockdown. Another thought would be regarding the U.S. or other countries that have chosen to relax their restrictions quickly. And I keep on reading in the newspapers nowadays that a lot of people are suffering from pandemic fatigue and loosening their restrictions. And I don't know what's happening in the UAE, but in the US, we have now been experiencing our third surge. I guess could I assume that the UAE has a somewhat moderate high incidence of virus because you guys are testing out 2 vaccines? Is that, do you have a high incidence of viral spread in your communities that you guys are testing out two different types of vaccines?
Not sure. I think it would be hard to quantify because as a country, we're testing a very large proportion of the population every day. So we're finding a much larger proportion of the asymptomatic fraction than many countries. So I don't know. I don't know whether colleagues have any thoughts. I think I wouldn't say we're definitely not high incidence. I would have thought low to moderate.
I see. Okay. All right. Another thought is testing it in the global south, where locations that are unable to do social distancing because a lot of people live close together, large families in small apartment complexes, but that testing it in the global south has a lot of implications for justice and exploitation. So be that as it may, again, the issue is to test it in locations that have a high incidence of virus. So again, the issue is a time factor, and that's what brings up the case for experiments on human volunteers. And so the social value is mainly coming from the time factor. Instead of waiting for participants to be exposed in field trials, challenge trials short circuit that process by exposing people deliberately to the virus. So essentially, human challenge studies can advance the rollout of a more efficacious vaccine. And if you get such a vaccine, if you could ramp it up just by a few months, that has large implications for life saves and also for the economy. And hence, human challenge studies would be more ethically acceptable doing, this is saying doing inter-epidemic periods when field trials would be unfeasible. But as you can see, we keep on experiencing these surges of the vaccine. So the field studies are not necessarily unimportant in that respect. Now, this slide shows in more detail why challenge studies speeds up. So this on the bottom pane, we have the traditional randomized controlled trial. First, you have phases 1 and 2, where you look at safety, and then you do these phase 3 trials, large field trial, 30,000 participants, and it takes this much time. Now, with a challenge study, you prepare your challenge system, you prepare the virus, the vaccine, and the virus itself, and because the virus will be somewhat attenuated, and then you do efficacy assessment in the challenge study, and then once you have what you think are your most efficacious vaccines, then you do large-scale, short-term, expanded phase 2 safety studies. And essentially, the concept is that you would have identified the vaccine at the end of this period, and hence again it's going to be much shorter than a phase 3 trial, and even if it's just by a few months, that has a lot of social value, and so that's where the time factor comes in. And so the scientific justification for challenge studies are shown in this slide. Again, you could develop a vaccine much sooner. You could select better vaccines. You could challenge studies may be the only way to test vaccine efficacy. And then you could get a lot of other knowledge about the virus regarding immunity, infection, and transmission, modes of transmission as well. Now, so we talked about the social value, the scientific justification for doing these challenge studies. What about the risks of challenge studies? And so now, usually, as I mentioned before, with influenza, usually human challenge studies are conducted in less lethal diseases like malaria, schistosomiasis, and influenza. However, COVID-19 has been shown to be a dangerous disease. And in fact, we still don't know the full extent of COVID-19 illness, and especially its long-term effects. We do have an idea that the fatality risk in adults less than 30 years is about 0.007 to 0.03%. And then, as I mentioned before, the need for rescue medicine for when the healthy human volunteers do get ill. And that's been a major deal breaker for doing these challenge studies. Having said that, the plan for these challenge studies that will right now begin in January, the plan is to use remdesivir as the rescue medicine for volunteers who get ill. Though having said that, recently the WHO recovery study showed no benefit with remdesivir, so I'm not sure what's going to be the value of using that drug. Now, I showed you in the previous slide the fatality risk, 0.07 to 0.03%. Is that an unreasonable risk? Well, we ask people to take risks for other people all the time. We ask volunteer firefighters to rush into burning buildings. And during this pandemic, we are asking healthcare providers to fight a pandemic at a higher risk than what healthcare providers are usually exposed to. So this issue of risk parity, if we ask healthcare providers to take higher risk, so what is the ethical concern with asking healthy human volunteers to take additional risks for this pandemic? Also, think about this. Living kidney donations. We have people who are willing to give their kidney to a relative or even to a stranger, and the fatality risk is similar to what we think the risk is from getting infected with COVID-19. So is this really an unreasonable risk to ask healthy volunteers to take? So in regards to trying to minimize the risk, right? This is what a good IRB wants to do or wants to see in a study. How are we minimizing risk? And we mentioned this. We're enrolling healthy patients so that the incidence of severe disease is low, and participants would be monitored carefully following the challenge study and afforded the best available care if needed. In fact, as I'll show in another slide, these participants will be quarantined for several weeks because we want to minimize the harm to third parties. So they're going to be in essentially lockdown for several weeks and quarantined and carefully monitored. And hopefully, by the time we do the challenge study, we may even have better therapeutics available as a rescue medicine.
Yeah. Is it recommended to have this challenge subject be hospitalized and monitored like you do in phase 1 or phase 2?
Well, they're going to be in a special lab.
All right.
They're going to be monitored for about 4 to 6 weeks. Okay.
Right.
And quarantine, and essentially quarantine and monitored. And even after quarantine, they're going to be carefully monitored with visits to the hospital, checking their labs, their antibodies, and essentially everything else that needs to be monitored. So these are ways to minimize the risk. Now, having said that, there are still several uncertainties. What is the actual time to actually complete a challenge study? And essentially, let me show this slide. Now, it could be that the time it takes to prepare a challenge system may take a long time. Right here. So previously, it was this model here to prepare a challenge system, but it actually may take up to 6 months to prepare a challenge system, meaning developing the attenuated virus and also testing the vaccine to see which vaccine is the most efficacious. So essentially, by the end of the day, the time period may be similar.
How do you ensure the proper dosing of the challenge? The dose is appropriate.
Well, that's
The challenging dose.
That's what you do in this phase. Is you're testing the human volunteers with different doses, different vaccines, different doses.
I don't mean the vaccine. I mean the challenge dose of the virus.
The viral load
that will cause the infection.
The
How
viral
you
load
ensure
given to the
how you ensure that you are giving the appropriate load or dose of the virus to induce the illness?
Well, that's a good question. I'm assuming that occurs in this phase when you're preparing the challenge system, and I think the question you ask is essentially could be a reason why this part of the challenge study may take a longer time.
I think this requires animal study prior. I mean, as a phase 0, do an animal before to challenge them and see how much dose you need. Then you do the calculation to move it to human to give them the right dose, right challenge, amount of viral to be inhaled or to be inserted to the body.
Well, they're not using any animal studies.
But how would you define the challenge dose? I agree. I thought defining the challenge dose is done in animals. So there is animal study.
Animals. I think. I mean, that then you're assuming that what dose in animals is going to be generalizable to humans. I'm going to have to punt on that question. I mean, that's a good question to ask, and I think that that answer is going to be preparing the challenge system, is finding what dose you want to use, because obviously if you use a very attenuated virus, right, then you're not giving the vaccine a good assessment. If you use a very low virulent virus to test, I agree with you absolutely, but I think that this happens in this part of the challenge system, and again, it if it takes a long time to prepare this challenge system, then you really haven't bought any time whatsoever. Again, the preparation of the challenge system could take 6 months or long. They're saying they're going to have it ready by January. You have to prepare the facility, the staff training. You need several months to set up the protocol, get community engagement and approval. Well, here it is. You need to start at low doses and escalate. And it's a dose finding issue, just like in regular drugs. So again, you keep on escalating until you get mild illness, and sometimes ordinarily it could take 6 months or more, or 1 or 2 years. So we'll see what happens with these challenge studies.
Professor Henry, there seems to be a relationship between the viral load and disease severity.
Exactly.
So in that case, the dose escalation is critical, because obviously we're wanting to ultimately prevent severe disease. So we need to see how the vaccines work with sort of medium and high viral loads.
Right. Well, you do want to. One time I served on the DSMB for dengue vaccine, and we did give escalating doses of the dengue organism, and we kept on escalating the doses until we had an effect, illness, but mild illness, but we didn't want to cause severe illness. So it's a careful tightrope balancing act between, you want to make sure you have a virus that does cause illness, but not severe illness. And that's why, well, when even in ordinarily phase one dosing escalation studies, if you ever sign up for a phase one trial, you want to ask how many cohorts have come before you, because right as you keep on escalating the dose, you may be more of a guarantee of getting toxic effects. We call those studies, we want to find the maximum tolerated dose, right? In ordinary drug development, the maximum tolerated dose. And how do you find the maximum tolerated dose? Well, you keep on doubling the dose until you find a dose that's not tolerated. And then you take the dose before, right? So in phase one studies, the goal is to produce harm, if you want to call it that. We want to keep on doubling it until we find an untolerated dose of the drug, and then we back off to the previous cohort. So it's the same way with these challenge studies.
With this challenge, it's always attenuated strains?
I'm sorry?
With the challenge, it is always attenuated strains? Or it's light strains or weak?
Good question. It's I don't know. I think that's how they're doing it with the attenuated strain.
But attenuated strain usually used as a vaccine to develop antibodies and protection.
Right, yes, right, right.
If it's not going to cause any infection, then I mean, challenge usually is like, I don't know, because it should be live vaccine so they can.
I think right, that's with the vaccine, with the, trust me, I'm not a how do you say the word?
It must be live virus.
Yeah, it must be live virus, I believe.
Live virus, but it must be attenuated. Let me investigate in that because well, I don't. I'm going to have to profess ignorance on that, on how the ins and outs of the challenge system, because it. I think they must be doing something with the virus. Let me find that out. So other uncertainties with the challenge studies is against it does involve confidence about risk estimates. Is the fatality risk higher than what we think? And what about the long-term risk? Is risk therapy available? And then again, harm to third parties. And already mentioned that we put the volunteers in legal quarantine 24 hours a day in a high security facility. And then the issue is about generalizability of the findings to high-risk populations because we're using young, healthier volunteers. And I have here exposed to a less risky viral strain, and hence will it be generalizable to the virus that's actually out there? So those are the uncertainties. Now, so we talked about social value, scientific justification. We talked about the risk. Now, what about informed consent? Is it possible to have informed consent? Now, the issue, there's been challenge studies before. The issue with previous challenge studies that has been unethical, obviously, the Nazi experiments. During World War II, we did challenge studies on prisoners in the US with cholera. And actually, at the Nuremberg trials, the defense for the defendants was that, hey, the US were doing challenge studies on prisoners as well. So what's the difference here? And the US defense knew that that point was going to come up in the deliberations in the Nazi trials. And then we have the Willowbrook experiments that involved deliberately infecting children who are mentally challenged in an institution with the hepatitis virus in order to find a vaccine. And that was very controversial as well. And so previous challenge studies, the major concern is that it involved vulnerable subjects. So the issue is, are we going to include vulnerable subjects with these human challenge studies, and what makes for a vulnerable subject? So just for your information, there is a website called One Day Sooner that has been up for the last several months and asking people if they would volunteer for human challenge studies. And so far, close to 40,000 people have signed up. I signed up myself just out of curiosity about the process, so I could get their weekly emails. Quite frankly, I would not. I would fit their exclusion criteria to be in a challenge study, but this has come from 160 countries, and all they need is about 20 participants. So my question to you is what would be an appropriate incentive for these individuals? Okay, so I want you to vote. What do you think? $1,000, $2,000, $4,500, or $10,000? What would it take to enroll people?
Is this just for context? Would this be anywhere in the world, or this would be the UAE or
Okay,
UK?
good question. Well, this is happening in the UK.
It's for COVID-19.
Yes, right. A challenge study in the UK. Now, having said that, I'm not sure if they're just taking people from the UK, because as I showed you in the previous slide, participants from over 160 countries. So what?
I think in the UK a lot of people would do it for $1,000 US, but
Are
That's
you
not the
saying
question.
they're more needy? That
I
I
think
think it would
they-
only take 1,000 to get them involved?
Salam.
Don't you think if you put it money driven, then you are driving the people who are from the low social economic class and who are in need?
Oh, okay, hold that thought. That's a good thought. I do have a response to that.
But you're talking about challenge now. We're talking about healthy volunteers for phase 3 the vaccine.
No, challenge.
Challenge. That means you're going to be in a lab for 4 to 5, 6 weeks.
That's
So
right.
that means, yeah,
That's
that may
right.
require you out of job, or you're not being paid outside. So I would say minimum of 4,500. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
all
I
right.
can't change my vote now, but that's a good point.
Okay, right. These people are going to be quarantined in a facility 3 to 6 weeks, blah, blah, blah. Come back for visits.
Yeah. For taking a vaccine, less money people would go for. I mean, like they can only take a vaccine or being part of a trial phase 3. But talking about challenge, you could be hospitalized in the lab, quarantined for all this. So probably they're going to ask higher. I mean, it should be compensated higher amount of. Money.
Are there incentives for the randomized control trials?
They supposedly, but I don't know if they give them or not. But because they travel back and forth to the hospital, they come for check, they spend some time with. So supposedly some money should be there, but I don't know how much they've been given to. Or
I see, some money. Okay, so all right. So when you think this out about how much time and burden and all that, yeah, most people are saying $4,500, and in fact, that's the proposed payment, $4,500 for the human volunteers. So what about anybody concerned about this concept of undue inducement? Does that negate informed consent, $4,500? So what is the concern with undue inducement? We say that all the time, undue inducement. Theoretically, the concern is, well, if the incentive is too high, then there's a concern that participants will not consider the risks of the study, and they're too focused on the incentive. Actually, studies have shown that when people enroll in studies in which the incentive is high, they get the feeling, well, the reason why the incentive is high is because it's a risky study. So if anything, getting a high incentive alerts participants that this may be a risky study. Also, when you think about it, if you have a proper IRB who consider risks of a study, and IRBs tend to be paternalistic in the sense that they will not approve riskier studies, and even in those studies that are high risk, they ensure that there's a good process for informed consent. So in my mind, this whole concept of undue inducement is a moral fiction. And we say it all the time, though we don't have any proof. Now, on the table was a concern of disproportionate enrollment of low-income populations. Well, actually, the evidence shows that as the payment increase, you get more buy-in from wealthier individuals as the price goes up. And in fact, if you look at that previous website, the One Day Sooner website, it shows that what kind of people are signing up on the website. You got people in professions, healthcare workers, people from all walks of life. It's interesting that should we have as an exclusion factor people who are unemployed?
Not necessarily, I believe. I mean,
yeah, I agree with that. I don't think we should prevent people from the opportunity to enroll in a study.
I think people in UAE, I mean, for the trial done in Abu Dhabi, the Chinese vaccine and Mohab, a majority of employees are from other Emirates, Northern Emirates, and they work in Abu Dhabi. And they because every time they have to go enter Abu Dhabi twice a week, they have to do PCR testing. So they told them that if you take the vaccine, you don't have to do any testing anymore. So many people they joined the vaccine trial only not to do testing every other day, for example. So that was one way of paying back or getting some kind of incentives.
I say, well, yeah, right. Essentially, you either have to be unemployed or you have to have good benefits to take off from the work. So actually, there was this article that was trying to present the argument that the bigger worry is underpayment rather than overpayment, as you are trying to figure out about the amount of time that someone has to spend in quarantine and going back for visits. Someone calculated that the minimum that people, even with $4,500, are being paid less than the minimum wage of $15 an hour. And hence this issue of underpayment is such that there's a concern that we may be exploiting healthy volunteers to be in these challenge studies for only $4,500, considering their time, burden, and the risk that they undertake. So $4,500 actually may not even be enough. So getting back to our framework, I think to summarize, I think there is social value. I think informed consent is possible. I don't think that there's any undue inducement. Scientific justification may be a question mark in the sense that will a challenge study, again, that challenge system, how long will it take to find the right viral strain when you test it in humans? Reading over my notes, they will use some kind of attenuated viral strain and try to find the right dose. So I don't know if we're going to save time. And in regards to the risk to the participants, I think there is a concern in the sense that I don't think we have a good rescue medication available, and we don't know the long-term side effects of being infected with the virus. And in fact, I'm reading all the time where people who have recovered from COVID-19 are still having continued side effects, especially with memory and also motor disability. And so there's concern with the long-term side effect. Someone mentioned that in addition to giving cash incentive, that these individuals should get long-term health insurance to prepare for the long-term side effects of COVID-19. Having said that, there is still good justification for risky vaccine trials, again, considering how this pandemic is really not being well controlled, and people are suffering from what's called pandemic fatigue. So let me just end by saying a few words in regards to this emergency use authorization. Essentially, this allows unimproved medical products or unimproved uses of approved medical products to be used in times of a public health emergency. The UAE process isn't as stringent as a full FDA approval. Essentially, you take data from phase 3 studies to support an emergency use authorization, which may result from an interim analysis. Essentially, what the FDA in the US is requiring is median follow-up of at least 2 months after completion of the full vaccination regimen. So even if you stop the trial for efficacy at one point, then you want follow-up of at least 2 months to look at the adverse events and assess the duration of protection, and essentially you want to try to make as best as possible a benefit risk determination, but you need the information, and that's why you need the 2 months. And that's why we're not going to get approval of a vaccine until, at best, until the end of the year. And that's thinking that they're going to stop the trial at the first interim analysis, which is projected to be after enrollment of 53 patients in the placebo group. And if it doesn't show any efficacy at that interim analysis, then they'll go on for several more months after that. So right now there are 2 contenders, Pfizer's and BioNTech's jointly produced vaccine and Moderna's vaccine. And as I said before, they may have some preliminary results by the end of this month or by the end of next month. So the question I want to ask you, so let's say if the FDA approves emergency use authorization of a vaccine, what happens with the other vaccine trials? Do you why don't you try to say in a few words, is it ethical to continue with the other vaccine trials to have people stay in the placebo groups? Do you stop those trials? Do you keep them going? Now you have a vaccine that's been approved for emergency authorization. Does that mess up the other vaccine trials? What do you think? What do you do with those vaccine trials? You let them continue? Is it ethical to let them continue? Okay. Continue. May need more than one type of vaccine. Do you tell the people in the placebo group that you could drop out of the study? Right? One of the requirements of informed consent is that if one gets additional information, that one has to provide that to the participants. Do you provide them? Do you let the people in the study know about the emergency use? Okay, but a lot of people are saying continue. Okay, do you tell the participants? Okay, right, different countries. Is for a certain group. You meaning like for healthcare workers, or like in China, students or business people? Okay, all right, for a certain group. Okay, all right. All right, good. So yes, that's the right. So we need to evaluate other potentially vaccines that may be superior. The first vaccines to roll off the table may not be very efficacious, and the issuance of a UAE should not, in and of itself, require unblinding of a COVID-19 vaccine trial, and essentially we need to keep on testing. In regards to telling the participants, I think to be transparent, I think that we do need to tell participants that there's a UAE, but you're right, the UAE may be earmarked for certain groups. That's why you have an emergency use authorization. So this is a slide in summary. And I'll post the PowerPoint on the website. Essentially, what this shows are the different types of trials. These are the traditional phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. The trials that's combining phases 1 and 2 and 3. The UAE emergency use, and then these are the challenge studies, and this shows the speed. So actually the challenge studies decreases or increases the speed or decreases the time. These are the number of participants, thousands in the traditional way, much less with the challenge studies. The risks to participants, low and carefully monitored. Here, the risks are higher. Also with the emergency use authorization, because you've only studied the safety profile for 2 months. The cost is high because of the number of participants. Here, the cost much less. Feasibility, in terms of doing the regular randomized trials, you're just, telling people to go out in the atmosphere Here, the feasibility is much less in the sense that you have to build those challenge labs and have those quarantine facilities, and then the social risk, distrust, or negative public perception usually low because you're not injecting people with the viral strain, and here distrust could be quite high. Think about it. You have a challenge study and a individual dies. And you have to think about the public trust in the scientific method. This is the so-called scoreboard for these challenge studies. I don't think your IRB will probably be involved in looking at a protocol for a challenge study because I don't think that every country has the ability to build the facility for a challenge study. But having said that, I think it's very interesting to look at the ethics of these challenge studies because some of the ethics are similar to regular studies that you get, phase 1 studies, the incentives, the informed consent, and whatnot. So with that, I think, so just some concluding remarks. Finding a safe and effective vaccine would be of great value. Large randomized trials are currently the most efficient, generalizable, scientifically robust path to establishing vaccine efficacy and collecting safety and efficacy data without compromising ethical and scientific norms. However, in parallel, the development of a vaccine by using a human infection model should proceed in parallel fashion in order to develop a more efficacious vaccine. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. Any remaining thoughts about challenge studies?
Maybe just one comment on your thoughts on realistically a vaccine, being the magic bullet everyone's hoping for, because if the cutoff is a sort of 50% effective for some people, so it's going to be effective for some people some of the time. History shows that with influenza, for example, you need regular booster doses, and it changes each year. And for coronaviruses, we haven't invested as much resources and research, but obviously MERS we didn't, and SARS-CoV-1 we didn't.
Yeah, right. So actually, I was just reading this with the influenza vaccine. The way they tested that, they looked at mild to moderate symptoms. They weren't developing vaccines to prevent deaths. So actually, influenza vaccines actually do not decrease deaths from the influenza virus because it causes more morbidity than deaths, and hence they're testing out the COVID vaccines in the same way as I showed you in a previous slide, where if someone they're counting people who get mild COVID infection as having a positive result. And so I am concerned that the vaccine is not going to be the magic bullet. And it's a lot of issues. I think the first vaccines to roll off the table are not going to be very efficacious. And I don't think it may be efficacious in preventing mild symptoms, but who really cares about that? And I think that another concern is people will get the vaccine and then they may let down their guard and not continue to practice social distancing and wearing masks and all that. I mean, personally, right? When a vaccine gets available, I'm first in line, right? Where all you guys on the front lines too will be first in line. Personally, I'm not going to feel all that protected. And so, and then once you get the vaccine, again, it'll be more than a year before it becomes available to everybody in the population. It won't be the magic bullet. And so I think we're still in it in the long haul. I think that fortunately, drug companies are still trying to develop therapeutics for the COVID illness. I think it's going to be a combination of factors. Because the vaccines won't be all that effective, you still need good therapeutics. And I think that studies have shown that the mortality from COVID has decreased because we understand the illness a little bit better and we know how to treat it better. But I think it's because we know how to deal with the respiratory illness. We're using anticoagulants, but we still don't have a magic bullet in terms of therapeutics. So I tend to take a cynical view. I still think we have a lot to do to deal with this illness, and that's another way of me saying that it's still, for me personally, it's still going to be a while before I engage in indoor dining at a restaurant. So it's going to be, I'm perfectly fine with cooking home cooked meals. Okay. That's my take on the immediate future with this illness. I would like to be able to travel again.
What are the chances that COVID-19 get extinct like SARS?
Well, that's a good question. How did SARS get?
SARS has disappeared.
Yes, right. How did that happen?
How did it happen? Nobody knows how did it happen. It just disappeared.
Yeah, right. Well, it's a different viral strains, and public health experts has been preparing for this for years, and for a virulent strain that is very what word am I trying to find? That's very infectious, airborne, infectious, and we're in it for, I think, we're in it for the long haul. We have to learn to adapt, and hopefully we'll get a effective vaccine, but it's not going to be, again, I hate to be cynical, but I don't think it's going to be by the end of November, because the bar is so low, right? We're only looking for 50% efficacy.
Yeah.
And it's going to get approved. And I guess 50% is better than nothing, but it's not the answer.
But the flu vaccine is as well is only 50% efficacy.
I'm sorry, the flu vaccine?
Is also 50%. I mean, we had this challenge with the viruses. We are capable only of producing 50% efficient vaccines, or nothing at all, except the old viruses. I mean, all the recent coronaviruses and flu viruses have been challenging us, because we are capable only of either producing vaccines with 50%.
What's the efficacy of the polio vaccine?
Yeah, but the polio is not in the recent.
No, but I'm saying it's
Eradicated.
Yeah,
isn't it like 100%?
Yeah, we had the smallpox vaccine and the polio vaccine that they were effective. But I
Right.
mean, in the recent years, talking about coronaviruses and flu, we've been challenged. We could so far not win a battle. So
I don't know what's the efficacy of the influenza vaccine. That's a good question.
I think polio is very high, isn't it? At 98, 99%.
yeah, and smallpox is 100%.
Smallpox, polio, measles, that's all.
But the flu vaccine is 50%, and
Is it?
even the last year vaccine which has been produced, there was a lot of talk about it in the CDC that it even failed to achieve the 50%. It was
But
around
the,
45% at the end.
But the death rate from influenza is
Is much less.
much
Less,
less, right? So that's the issue.
Yeah, but what I meant to say that our likelihood of succeeding to get a vaccine effective against the coronavirus more than 50% is low, looking back at our history with corona and flu over the previous years. I think the only way for us to overcome COVID-19 is really to get an antiviral drug that works for it as well, that goes hand in hand with the vaccine.
Right, I agree. That's what I said. We have to also depend on therapeutics as well.
And public health measures.
Well, right, absolutely. So, as I said before, there is this pandemic fatigue.
Yeah.
And people just want to go back to their normal social lives. And so it's difficult. I mean, I've watched several months ago all those pandemic movies in which there were riots, and Albert Camus, The Plague. You read that book, it's just like reading what's happening now. Pandemic fatigue is a natural phenomenon. So we have to rely, it's a combination, vaccines and therapeutics. So,
Let's
okay.
hope for the best.
I'm sure there'll be more. Well, the next few months will be interesting to see what happens with the vaccines and what happens with the challenge trials.
I still feel the challenge trial unethical.
What's that?
I still feel the challenge trial unethical. It's still unethical to me.
Unethical. Okay, but we'll end on this note. Why, in your mind? what makes you, I mean,
Because of all of I've just mentioned, because of the history of flu and coronavirus, because we have failed over years to produce effective vaccine, and because we have a virus which is having a fatality, and we cannot promise the people who get into the challenge trial anything if they get a severe disease. We can do nothing for them.
I know, but we're more likely to develop a more efficacious vaccine with a challenge preparation.
Not more than 50% looking backward at our history with coronavirus.
I don't know.
So I don't see, I mean, unless you would tell me you're going to really, you're going to develop by the challenge studies a vaccine that have 80% protection, 60% protection, maybe.
Well, I don't know what's the exact number, but I think that if there's a vaccine that's more than 50% effective, you're gonna be able to identify it faster with a challenge preparation than a regular randomized controlled trial, because you're testing it in the lab before you test it in the field. You have more evidence of something that's efficacious, and then the only reason why you test it in the field is for safety. Whereas in the randomized controlled trial, you're testing it for efficacy and safety. And that takes a longer time. So in terms of identifying a vaccine, a challenge study is theoretically better in terms of that. But it comes with its risks. You're purposefully injecting someone with a virus. So it comes with risks. But again, as I said before, we're asking healthcare workers to take on more risks. And I don't know about your hospitals, but in my hospital, a lot of healthcare workers are not getting hazard pay.
And also, what if the disease just disappeared like SARS and you have already exposed people to the risk?
Okay, well, don't hold your breath. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Very good. So I'll post this recording on, and let me look at the topics, and I'll let you know what we'll discuss next week, unless there's a burning desire to. You've seen the list. Or I'll just pick one. I'll just pick one out of this hat. Okay, for next week. Okay. All right. Good.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you.
It has been a joy. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Good night.
Fascinating.
Good night, everybody.
All right,
Ma'as-salam.
good night.
Good night.
Good discussion. Thank you.
Good night.